Okay, one of the things that I want to share with you guys just about for lab, getting kind of ready for next week is remember last time, or not next week, next lab, Thursday. Remember last time I kind of mentioned every time your artery or your vein, your vessel branches, we change its name. So a good way to get started studying for the vessels, because they are very difficult, is to take your list of vessels that we give you and then begin to kind of trace them out. So I'll do the veins because the veins are the hardest on the upper body and kind of give you an idea here. All right, so this is my guy. I'm just going to draw his heart. On veins, I trace them going out away from the heart, but is that the way the blood would be flowing if it's a vein? No, it would be flowing towards the heart, right? So even though I'm going to trace them away from the heart, know that the blood flow would be going in the opposite direction. So if I start up here, I would have my first return vessel would be my superior vena cava, like this. It is going to make a branch like this. It kind of makes this Y right here. This is the left brachiocephalic vein. I'm going to abbreviate. And so this would be my right brachiocephalic vein. It's going to branch. What happens when it branches? It changes names. So here's a branch. Let me clean this up just a little bit. This branch goes up the side of my neck right here. This, because this is the right side of his body, this would be my right jugular. And one branch keeps coming across here like this. What area, what region of the body do you think this is? Subclavian. So this would be my right subclavian. I'm going to put a C for subclavian. And at this point, we're kind of headed down the arm like this. We're going to have one branch that comes off up here, and it goes down the outside of the arm like this. If this is the elbow right here, you have one branch that comes here. This branch is called the cephalic vein. All right, this little stretch right after the branch for the cephalic vein changes the subclavian into the axillary. So this would be the right axillary vein. What region of the body is axillary? Armpit. So it kind of lines right up with the top of the armpit area. That would be, and it's right after the cephalic branch. That would be my right axillary. Then it comes down and there's a branch right here. This branch comes down to the elbow on the inside of the arm right here. This is called the basilic vein. And then the one that comes right down the middle is called the brachial vein. And then where the basilic cuts over to join the cephalic vein right here, there's a branch, but this is called the median cubital. What region of the body is cubital? Elbow, right? Front of the elbow. So that I am just tracking, and I'm tracking away from the heart, but on your follow-up questions for your lab practical, a lot of my follow-up questions to vessels will be things like, where's the next place blood will flow from here? So let's say I pinned the basilic vein, and I said, where's the next place blood will flow from here? What would it be? Right up here, right? So it's the axillary vein. And you would be surprised, almost everybody tells me the vein below it. Remember, veins are flowing towards the heart, so you have to go back closer to the heart when you're needing those veins. So what I would encourage you to do between now and Thursday, if you get a chance, I know you guys are studying for your test, or even if you do this right after Thursday, after you take your test, is practice tracking those branches up and naming them. When I go to the cadaver and I point them out to you and I label them for you, that's exactly how I find them, is I track the branches out and I know exactly what I'm looking at. So it's a good way to begin to study these various veins and arteries. All right, so that's the venous side. If I go to the arterial side is much easier because we don't make you learn a lot of the arteries on the upper body. Okay, now which way would my blood be flowing? Away. So what's the first vessel it leaves the heart from? What's the first vessel out of the heart? This one, right? What is this? Aorta. And then I have my three branches, right? What's the first one? Brachiocephalic, and it branches. It's going to change names when it branches, right? So what's the one that goes up to my neck? Right, common carotid. What's the one that goes this way? Subclavian. So this is my right subclavian artery. There's some branches, and you don't have to know what these ones are, but between these branches, right at the top of my armpit, would be my axillary artery. And again, you don't have to name these branches. You're just going to look for this little stretch between these two branches. That's your axillary artery. After the second branch, this becomes your brachial artery. And that's all you have to know on the arm side. For that side, then you have to know this one. This is my left carotid. And then this would be my left subclavian, and the branching would mirror that side exactly at that point. All right, so if you were going to trace your arterial branches, that's what you would do on this side. And then I drew a diaphragm in here because at this point, we would go into the lower body over here. So let me do the veins and the arteries for you on the lower body. Oops. All right, so I'm going to start up here. I'm going to put my diaphragm up here. And I'm going to come down. Here's my guy's legs. And I'm going to move his diaphragm up just a little bit higher. Okay, the first vessel, this descending abdominal aorta is going to go right down through the diaphragm. So here it comes right here. It comes right down through the diaphragm. This is my diaphragm. Up here, this is called the descending thoracic aorta. As soon as I come through the diaphragm, it becomes the descending abdominal aorta. Okay, the very first branch that you're going to run into when you come through the diaphragm is one that it's kind of right up here. And this is called the superior mesenteric. I'm sorry. The first one's the celiac. This is called the celiac trunk. The celiac trunk has three fingers that come off of it. One goes this way, one goes this way, and one goes this way. So you have this little trunk, kind of like we have the brachiocephalic trunk that has two branches off of it. This is the celiac trunk. It has three branches. This branch goes to the liver. It is called the hepatic artery. This one goes to the stomach. It's called the gastric artery. And this one goes to the spleen. Your spleen sits over here. And this one is called the splenic artery. Right underneath the celiac trunk, like right here, is the superior mesenteric. What did I say the mesenteries were? What are they?
Hi guys.
Yeah, they go to the intestines, right? They're the tissues that hold the intestines. So this is going to feed blood to my upper large and small intestines up here to the mesenteries. The next branches come here and here. And these guys go to the kidneys, so they're the renal arteries. So we have the right renal artery and we have the left renal arteries. And then we come down to this V right here. There's one more that comes right off the front this way. And this one's the inferior mesenteric. What do you think it's feeding? These are renal arteries. What are mesenteries? Part of the intestines, right? So inferior mesenteric's feeding my lower intestines and my large and small intestines. Down here where it branches, right here, these are the common iliacs. What region of the body is this? Iliac, right? Because this is where my ileum is. So this would be the left common iliac. And this is going to be the right common iliac. There's a branch then right here that goes inside. At this point, this becomes the internal iliac. And this becomes, oh, I made this one really fat. This one becomes the external iliac. And then when it goes over the hip bones, I have to lower my guys. It's going to go over the hip bones. As soon as it goes over the hip bones, it becomes the femoral vein. I'm sorry, femoral artery. Like that. So those are all of your arteries that you have to know below the diaphragm. It goes celiac trunk, has my 3 fingers. One goes to the liver, hepatic. One goes to the stomach, gastric. One goes to the spleen, splenic. Then there's a branch right below it off the descending abdominal aorta. Feeds the mesenteries. It's called the superior mesenteric. Then I have my left and right renal arteries that are going to go to the kidneys. I have my inferior mesenteric, which is going to, which I didn't even spell this right. And this is going to feed my lower intestines. I have my V at the bottom. These become left and right common iliac, left and right internal iliac, left and right external iliac. When they go over the hip bones, they become my left and right femoral arteries. All right, and then let's do the veins, the lower body veins. So I'll do kind of the same drawing. There's my guy's legs. All right, so the first vein comes from clear down here. It tracks all the way up to about right here. Longest vein in the body, this is the greater saphenous or saphenous vein. The greater saphenous feeds into the femoral vein. So before it goes over the hip bones, it joins this vein right here. And this vein is my femoral vein. From there, it mirrors the arteries exactly. So I would have my internal iliac vein, my external iliac vein. Beyond the branch, it would be my common iliac. So this would be the common iliac. And then does it feed into the aorta? What does blood return from the lower body in? What vein? What big vein? Yeah, this is my IVC, inferior vena cava, right there. All right, from down in this area, I have one vein that goes up and it joins my renal vein. So if this is my kidney and here's my renal vein going over, this joins the renal vein right there. This is called the left gonadal vein. It comes from the left gonad. So on our male, it would be from the testes. From our female, it would come from the ovaries. So both males and females have a gonadal vein. Your inferior vena cava is kind of clear off to the right-hand side of your body. So your left gonadal vein actually joins your renal vein and then follows the renal vein over into the inferior vena cava. Your right gonadal vein from over here actually goes right into the inferior vena cava. Oh, I drew my IBC. I don't know what it is. Oh, this would be, I see what I did. This is label should be here. This is my IBC. This would be my right gonadal. And it goes right into the inferior vena cava on the right side. On the left side, it goes into the renal vein. And then the only other vein you have to know here is there's one that comes here, right before the diaphragm. It goes to the liver. It is the hepatic portal vein. Okay, so that is all the vessels on your list. I think I'm doing them off the top of my head. I think I got them all. This is a very small amount of vessels compared to all the vessels in your body, but I know it's a lot of vessels to have to learn. So what would I do when you have a chance? You can focus on your test first, but between now and next Tuesday, I would practice just drawing these branches out, kind of like I did here, and you kind of learn the branches. And remember, every time it branches, it's going to change names. So you can begin to track all those different branches out, which will really help to apply it to the cadaver when we get back to the cadaver. And I'll show you how to track those branches when we get on the cadaver. Hopefully that'll help you guys just a little bit. Okay, today we're going to work on endocrine system, which we have actually, oh, I wanted to, Taylor reminded me, on the exam for Thursday, I wanted to just kind of warn you, it is a little heavy on the eyeball. So make sure you go back and you spend time really studying your eyeball stuff, because it was just it was pretty light on taste. And I would say it's probably just a little bit, probably the heaviest on the eye of the senses. And then the second sense it's probably the most heavy on would be the ear. But if you were going to pick a special sense, I would definitely study all those things I kind of highlighted. But there's quite a few questions about the eye, so I would definitely take time to go back and review the eye. I think that will help you a little bit if you keep that in mind as you study for your test on Thursday. All right, so for Thursday, we're also doing the endocrine system. We've actually gotten a pretty big jump on it. So let's review really quickly before we jump in. All right, let's do adrenal gland. Do you want me to draw them or should we just work on acronyms? Let's just work on acronyms. Adrenal gland, what's my layers to my cortex? All right, let's do the medulla. What's secreted in the medulla of the adrenal gland? What? Epinephrine and norepinephrine. They're going to do excitatory things. This is your adrenaline. Let's go to the cortex. What's my layers of my cortex? So that would be one of my hormones, my mineral corticoids. What's an example of one of the mineral corticoids? Aldosterone. What's it do? When you're dehydrated, we hold on to salt, which makes us hold on to water. Which layer secretes mineral corticoids? Yes. So that's my first layer, right? That's my mineral corticoids. What's my second layer? Fasciculata. What's it secrete? Yep, glucocorticoids like cortisol. What is cortisol? Helps to manage stress, right? We dump glucose and things like that in stress situations. Your body thinks of it like fight or flight stress. And this is where it's bad, because if we're stressed about stuff that's not fight or flight, your body doesn't differentiate. All right, what's our most inner layer of our cortex? Reticularis. And what's it secrete? Gonadotropins, which are what? Good. They're part of the androgens, right? All right, so that is our adrenal glands. Let's do pituitary gland. Let's do our lobes. Anterior lobe, what's it secrete? TP flag. And what's TP? Thyroid stimulating hormone. When would we secrete it? Okay, what does it trigger to be secreted? TSH. It says secrete thyroid hormone, which is our T3s, T4s, right? And what do they, when would we secrete them? The metabolism's low, right? Because these say ramp up your metabolism. So these, what is the end result? Speed up metabolism. Metabolic rate. Okay, P. What is it? Prolactin. What's it do? Produces milk. What's my F? Follicle stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the follicles to produce eggs, whatever, eggs or sperm, haploid cells. What is L? Luteinizing hormone, what's it do? It helps to regulate cycles, like that are related to those haploid cells, sex cells. What is A? ACTH, what's that say? It talks to these guys right here. It says, hey, cortex guys, go secrete one of your hormones. So this is the stimulating hormone to the cortex of the adrenal gland. What's the G? I'll do the M next, but what's the G? Growth hormone, what's it say? Yeah, grow, right? Grow muscles, grow bones. This is our major, when we're going through puberty, our major puberty hormone. All right, what's right in the middle? Or what's it say? Melanin. So it's our melanin SH, melanin stimulating hormone. It goes and tells our melanocytes or melanocytes in our skin secrete more melanin. So this is oftentimes due to exposure to UV rays. All right, posterior pituitary gland. What's my hormones? Oxytocin, ADH. What's oxytocin do? Ramps up labor. We also see it like in the male reproductive system during ejaculation. What does ADH do? Antidiuretic. What's it do? Yeah, it tells the kidneys, take water back out of your renal tubules. So we secrete this when we are dehydrated. We would bring water back out of the kidney tubules. Kidneys, what's a hormone the kidneys secrete? EPO, what's it say? Make more red blood cells. So we would see that secreted when we're hypoxic. Hypoxic means you don't have enough oxygen. So we're going to secrete EPO, which is going to say, hey, go make more red blood cells. You're going to see your renin, which is part of the RAAS, which we'll talk about with the kidneys. But basically, this is going to help to affect blood pressure on this. Pineal gland. What's it secrete? What's that do? Sleep, feel good, it calms you. Oh my gosh, why can't I think of all the glands right now? Testes and ovaries, go next. Let's do testes. Testosterone is the big one, which says develop secondary sex characteristics, right? Do females have any testosterone? Yeah, absolutely, just a much lesser degree. Testosterone not only does secondary sex characteristics, which really these are a part of secondary sex characteristics, but they promote more lean body mass, which males have a more abundance of testosterone, which is why they tend to have a bigger musculature to them. So when females decline in testosterone, we would see a decrease in that muscle mass in females. It also participates in sex drive for both males and females. All right, what about ovaries? Estrogen, which does what? Secondary sex characteristics for females, right? What am I missing? Pancreas, thank you. Pancreas. What's it secrete? Glucagon, which does what? It increases blood sugar. Where do I get that sugar from? Yeah, skeletal muscles and the liver. So this is in the form of glycogen in muscles and liver. And then the second one it secretes is insulin. What's insulin do? Lowers blood sugar. And when would I secrete it? When my blood sugar is high. So we just ate some meal high in sugar. Thymus gland. What's it secrete? Thymosin. What's thymosin say? Yeah, mature your T cells, which is a form of those white blood cells. You have your T cells and your B cells. B cells come from the bone marrow. T cells come from the thymus, but they all participate. What am I missing? Did we get them all? Oh, thank you. Thyroid. We kind of touched on the thyroid. What's the thyroid do? It secretes three hormones. What are they? T3, T4, which do metabolism. Are we going to need metabolism like when we grow? Yeah. When you go through puberty, your T3, T4s are really high. Why? Building proteins takes metabolism, right? So we're going to see a ramp up of our T3s, T4s with puberty as well. What is another hormone that your thyroid secretes? Calcitonin, what's it do? Lowers blood sugar. It stops absorption of it and it goes and stores it away in your bones. Parathyroid hormone comes from where? Parathyroids, what's it do? Increases blood calcium levels. Where does it get the calcium from? So it says hold on to it in the digestive system and the kidneys. But if I don't have enough there from diet, I'm not going to let it go to waste. But where else can I go get it from? Yeah, it's from the bones, from the osteoclast. So parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclast, which go and break down my bony matrix, which is, if you remember that hydroxyapatite, and we break it down back into our calcium, phosphate, all that good stuff. That's what about in 201. Did I miss any of our glands? I think I hit them all. All right, so let's flip through here. That is a bulk of what you need to know for your test right there, for your lecture test, but also for your lab test. Okay, so I'm just going to touch a little bit on the secreting part of it. These are kind of what are the hormones we're secreting, but we're going to talk about the overall big umbrella types of hormones. All right, so endocrine cells produce about 30 different hormones or chemical messengers. You can see we did not touch on very many of these at all. These signals, these chemical signals, are one of the biggest signaling parts to the body. We do a lot of signaling with chemicals. All right, so with our signals, we can do direct communication. So one cell can talk directly to a neighboring cell, or we can have cells that indirectly talk. For example, the pituitary gland that says, hey, secrete thyroid stimulating hormone, is the hypothalamus who's bossing around the pituitary gland talking directly to the thyroid? No, I have some go-betweens in there. So some of ours are not a direct communication. Some of these guys are. If they directly communicate with each other, let me pull this down for you guys. We can do it through ion channels, through direct communication. Paracrine communication. this is when we talk, I would say paracrine are kind of a local chemical. They are talking right there to a local tissue is where we see paracrine. When might we see a paracrine type signal? If you guys remember back when we talked about skin and things, and we talked about a cut and they release a signal that says, hey, we're injured, we need a clot, we need to do that kind of stuff. That would be an example of a paracrine cell. It is secreting a chemical that's talking to those cells right there in that area. So it's a short-term signaler. It's a local signaler is your paracrine. Endocrine is going to be a long-term, long-range signal, like we saw over here. Most of these guys are endocrine signals. They're coming from far away, traveling through the bloodstream, and they have long-lasting effects. Paracrine signals do not tend to have as long of lasting effects. They tend to be kind of quick information. Was everybody good on that? All right, autocrine communication. This is where messages affect the same cells. A good example is I can get a cell, maybe my smooth muscle cells where I get, I don't know, an injury or something. I can have a signal say, hey, smooth muscles contract and make that blood vessel smaller. That would be an example of those hormones are telling that tissue what to do, right, in that exact area. Endocrine communication, I already kind of jumped to this. This is where we're sending a long-term signal. It's traveling through the bloodstream, and it is affecting target cells, probably pretty far away from the origin of the hormones. Long-term or endocrine hormones tend to last for a long time. A good example is growth hormone. How long do we really see the effects of growth hormone? Well, we continue to secrete it in puberty, but it can last with continual secretion, but it can be years that we're growing and seeing developmental changes. So it has a pretty long-term effect. All right, target cells, what are these? These are the cells that are receiving those chemical signals and are going to be doing the reacting to it. They're going to have some sort of a receptor that receives that signal. They're going to bring that signal into the inside of the cell somehow, and we'll talk about some of the various ways it does that. And then we're going to see a change inside of that cell, which is going to affect something bigger than itself. What are some of the changes? Some of them are to secrete an enzyme, or to secrete another hormone, or to secrete something. So that receptor would receive that signal will go to the inside of the cell, and it may tell the cell, hey, do this now. So again, some of those examples might be enzymes or other hormones. It could be structural proteins. In the case of like growth hormone, we would see cells then begin to build more protein structures and things like that. We can see an alteration of metabolic activities of multiple tissues. So that just means we're doing a lot of activity. We're going to see an increased metabolism. And we already kind of talked about like thyroid hormone. You're going to see it helping ramp up metabolism for growth of muscles that come from the signal from growth hormone. So you see a lot of growth type things are going to affect multiple or have multiple hormones affecting them. Synaptic communication, this is basically nerve to nerve, right? That's what a synapse is I have one nerve, it's going to pass a chemical, a neurotransmitter across the gap to another nerve on the other side. We also talked about, where else did we see a synaptic communication that caused a signal? That was a hormonal signal. You remember? I thought we talked about this, didn't we? Yeah. It goes to the adrenal gland, right? Oh, we did with the autonomic nervous system. We talked about this. So if I have a fight or flight response, we talked about like norepinephrine can be a neurotransmitter, but also a hormone. So it gets secreted as a neurotransmitter and it travels directly down to the adrenal glands. And it said, hey, adrenal gland, I know I just delivered the signal using norepinephrine, but I also need my adrenal medulla to secrete norepinephrine as a hormone. Do neurotransmitters last for a long time? No. Do hormones last for a long time? Yes. So that's why it might send an electrical or neural signal and say, hey, even though this is the same signal, send it as a hormone. Why? Because hormones have longer lasting effects. So where's the really big place we see this is with crisis management, which is going to go to my epinephrine, norepinephrine. It's really to my adrenal medulla. All right, so both endocrine and the nervous system rely on chemical signals. We use neurotransmitters in the nervous system, and then we use hormones when we're talking about in the endocrine system. What's the function of all of them? To maintain homeostasis, right? And we've already seen a couple examples of this. We said, hey, what happens when your blood calcium level is too low? We're going to secrete a hormone that says raise your blood calcium levels. What happens if our blood calcium levels are too high? We're going to secrete a hormone that says lower your blood calcium levels. So the function of all these hormones is to maintain homeostasis. What happens if we can't maintain homeostasis? Yeah, illness or death, right? You're going to be sick. You're going to have some sort of disease, which can lead to death. A good example of a disease that everybody's familiar with, diabetes. We're not secreting insulin that says lower blood sugar levels, and so we see illness, which can lead to death. And so we need these chemical messengers for homeostasis. Otherwise, we're going to see disease and death. We can have endocrine cells and tissues, organs. But we also have a lot of things that aren't considered part of the endocrine system that secrete hormones. A good example is the kidney. The kidney does not fall under the endocrine system, right? What system is the kidney part of? Urinary system, right? But we still see that the kidney secretes some hormones that help with the regulation of blood pressure and the amount of red blood cells. We talked about in 201, I don't know if you guys remember the difference between endocrine and exocrine. I think I kind of touched on it last week too. Endocrine is ductless and it secretes into interstitial fluid or into the bloodstream. Exocrine has a duct, secretes right onto epithelial tissues. So what would exocrine type things be? Saliva and digestive enzymes. What would endocrine be? These are going to be those chemical signals. Okay, and this kind of lists all of our endocrine, and again, we've talked about a lot of these. Hypothalamus, it produces ADH and oxytocin, which go directly to posterior pituitary gland for release. Anterior pituitary gland, we talked about all these guys. We did TP flag. Posterior oxytocin and ADH, pineal gland is melatonin, parathyroid is parathyroid hormone, thyroid's my T3s, T4s, calcitonin, my medulla of my adrenal gland is my epinephrine, norepinephrine, my cortex is my mineral corticoids, which is like my aldosterone, my glucocorticoids, which is like this cortisol, cortisone, some of these guys. And then my gonadotropins, was that right? Yeah, is that the one I didn't mention? I did glucocorticoids, yeah. These guys do my androgen, so I forgot which ones I'd mentioned. So these talk about all those other ones, my TP flags. These guys are not really considered, I don't know why this is doing this, part of the endocrine system, but look at all these other body systems or body organs that secrete hormones. So the heart, and we didn't even talk about the heart, but we will. It secretes AMP, BMP. These guys are going to help with regulation of blood pressure, so we're not blowing out arteries. Thymus, we talked about, it secretes thymosin. Adipose tissue secretes leptin. Digestive tract, the digestive tract has a lot of hormones, and when we do the digestive system, you're going to have to to learn all those. Someone just told me that T's test had a bunch of questions about the digestive system hormones. But these hormones are secreted within the digestive system and they signal back to the digestive system. So when food comes out of the stomach and dumps into the small intestines, we have chemoreceptors that say, oh my gosh, this has a lot of carbohydrates in it. And then it'll tell like the pancreas, hey, we need you to secrete enzymes that are going to help break down carbohydrates. Or we get a bunch of proteins that hit the small intestines. We secrete a hormone that says, pancreas, secrete more enzymes that are going to focus on proteins. So your digestive system has a lot of little hormones that talk to the organs that help with the breakdown of those various foods. And we'll get into the big details of these when we do the digestive system. Kidneys we talked about, gonads and ovaries we talked about. All right, classes of hormones. We have amino acid. What are these guys made up of? What kind of hormones are they? What's an amino acid? It's a what? It's a protein. So these are protein-based hormones, or amino acid. What about peptide? What's a peptide? Peptide bonds join amino acids, right? So both of these first two classes are protein-based hormones. We have protein-based hormones, we have lipid-based hormones. What is so important to note on the difference between these two hormones? If I go to my cell, like so, my cell membrane, you guys learned about hydrophobic, hydrophilic. Do you guys remember that part? So my phosphates are hydrophilic, which really means they have a charge to them, right? These are charged. These are lipids, no charge. Proteins have a charge to them, a slight charge, which means is a protein hormone going to diffuse through my cell membrane? No. Why? Because it has a charge. If it's a like charge, it's going to repel away from my phosphates. If it is an opposing charge, it's going to stop and hang out with the phosphates. Either way, it's not going through the cell membrane. So the important thing about amino acids versus lipid-based hormones is amino acids have to have a receptor on the outside of the cell, which receives that hormone and somehow passes the signal to the inside of the cell. The hormone itself is not going to diffuse or come into the cell. The signal from that is going to get passed to the inside of the cell. What about lipids? Do lipids have a charge? Do fats have a charge? If I pour fat oil on water, does it have a charge? What's it do? It floats on top, right? It doesn't mix in, which means it has no charge. So if it has no charge, it will diffuse right through the cell membrane. So lipid-based hormones will go right into the inside of the cell. Oftentimes they affect the DNA directly inside of the cell. What's the DNA, Carrie? The code. The code for what? Making what? Proteins, right? And if you remember back to the organic molecule chart, if you were in my class, I tortured you with it and I make you do monomers, polymers, functions. Proteins had a ton of functions in the body, right? And basically I said overall proteins tell the cell how to act and what its job is. If I change a protein, can I change its job? Yes, right? I'm changing its orders. So by sending a signal into the DNA, I might say, hey, begin to build this enzyme or secrete this hormone. So by changing the DNA, I change the protein, I can totally change the way that cell behaves. So maybe it's a cell in the pancreas that's responsible for secreting insulin. If I send a hormone, a lipid-based hormone in there, I can make it behave differently. So amino or protein-based hormones have to attach to a receptor on the outside of the cell, and we pass that signal to the inside, which can usually affect the protein itself or the mRNA. These are real common things that it affects. Lipid-based hormones oftentimes go right into the DNA. What are some lipid-based hormones? These are usually your steroid hormones like growth hormone. Is it one that would be like a lipid-based hormone? All right, so some of your amino acids are your like thyroid hormones, an amino acid. Serotonin, melatonin are amino acid hormones. Peptide hormones, again, these are also protein-based hormones. So can they absorb right through the cell membrane? No, they have to have a receptor. So we're still on the same type of hormone. These are things like your TSH, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. These are some good examples of your peptide hormones. ADH, oxytocin, insulin, growth hormone, prolactin. So there's a lot of amino acid based ones. Some of our lipid ones are our paracrine ones, our prostaglandins. I have to apologize, I thought growth hormone fell into the lipid class. It does not, evidently it's protein hormone. And your steroid hormones, these are your androgens, estrogens, kind of those long-term hormones. Right, how do we transport hormones? I kind of talked about this with the thyroid. I talked about T3, T4. And what I tell you was the difference between T3 and T4. I mean, there's several differences, but what was the one I shared with you? Yeah, one's active and one's inactive. Why do we put inactive hormones out in the bloodstream? Do they last very long in the bloodstream? I mean, we know they last longer than like neurotransmitters, but do we have other stuff floating around in our bloodstream that's going to the liver and the kidneys to be gotten rid of? Yeah, we have enzymes, we have all kinds of stuff that's floating around in our bloodstream. So freely circulating hormones are usually activated hormones, and they don't live very long compared to non-freely moving proteins. What do I mean by that? Some of our proteins are bound to carrier proteins. I'm sorry, some of our hormones are bound to carrier proteins. So we may just have T3 floating around through the blood. T4, we're going to stick it to a carrier protein. Why? Because it's not going to get broken down in the bloodstream. So it's going to be there available to be activated and used. All right, how do we break some of these down? They diffuse out. They get broken down by the liver and kidney. They get broken down, like I was mentioning, enzymes that are in the blood, in the interstitial fluids, things like that. So what are our inactivated? I already mentioned T4 is one that gets carried in an inactive form. Why? So we can keep it functional longer. 99% become attached to transport proteins in the blood. So we'll talk when we get to the blood about globular proteins in the blood. Oftentimes they're carrying things on them. Why? So those things don't get broken down and taken out of circulation so quickly. So basically, if we put them on a protein, we're going to make them last a little longer than if they're just free floating by themselves. So if you ever go to the doctor and they're testing like your thyroid hormone, a lot of times doctors only test your T3 levels, but really they should test T3, T4. It's a much more accurate way to determine if your thyroid is really functioning well. All right, so mechanisms. I kind of already talked about this. A hormone can alter genetic activity, kind of as I talked about here. We can affect the DNA, we can affect the mRNA, which is going to affect our protein. It's going to change the behavior of that cell. We can alter the rate of protein synthesis. So by moving to the inside of the cell, we can ramp up protein synthesis. or we can tone it down. Remember, enzymes are proteins, so I might be saying, hey, ramp up the production of a particular enzyme in the case of the digestive system I was talking about, as an example, or ramp it down if we don't need it. So that is an example. We can alter the types of proteins and the amount of proteins that we're making. And we can also change membrane permeability, so what comes in and out of the cells. Is everybody okay? All right, hormone receptor. This is just the cell or the receptor, the component of the cell on the outside of the membrane that receives. They are like a specific target. So based on shape, we will have a hormone come, and if it fits into that receptor, typically it's by shape, then it will attach and it will create that passage of my signal to the inside of my cell. However, that passage is going to look based on what attached to the outside. It will travel through the whole body and ignore all these cells, and it'll get to the target cell. One example, we talked about ADH. Where is ADH secreted? The posterior pituitary gland. And who does it affect? So clear up here in my brain, where does it affect? What does ADH do? Yeah, antidiuretic. So well, who's it affect? My kidneys. So how many gazillion cells does it pass my ADH before it gets to the kidneys? Probably a lot, right? And they all ignore it and it floats on by. Why do they ignore it? Because their receptors don't allow that hormone to fit into it. So how does it know to talk to its target cells? It fits in there, and then it can relay that signal into the inside. We can make cells more sensitive or less sensitive to a hormone. We call that downregulation or upregulation. So cells, if I have a high presence of a hormone, then the cells are going to become less sensitive to that hormone because there's so much hormone out there, it doesn't need all that hormone. So we call that downregulation. What does it do? It gets rid of some of these hormone receptors on the surface of the cell. So now there's fewer receptors, which makes the cell a little less sensitive because we're taking less hormones in. If I don't have very much hormone out there, I'm going to put more receptors out on the surface of my cell to catch those hormones that are floating by. That is called upregulation. So upregulation makes us more sensitive to a hormone. Downregulation makes us less sensitive to a hormone. And your cells have that ability to fluctuate up and down. I've heard it said that part of type 2 diabetes, I don't know if this is true, this is what I heard, I should go research it for myself and figure it out, but I've heard that type 2 diabetes is somewhat of a downregulation thing. For a while, so much insulin gets secreted in type 2 diabetes because typically people with type 2 diabetes have high sugar levels. Why? Because they eat a lot of sugar and breads and carbs and things like that. And so their cells downregulate. I should go and research that for myself, but that's what I heard. And it kind of makes sense. So as I already mentioned this, some of our amino acid or our protein hormones are going to attach to a receptor on the outside of the surface of the cell. What are they going to do? They're going to pass that signal to the inside of the cell, which is they're going to create some sort of a change. Lipid hormones or non-charged hormones are going to basically absorb right through the membrane. Why? Because they're not charged. So they can come right through the membrane and they're going to attach to some sort of a target on the inside of the cell, which then alters something inside the cell. Maybe it's a DNA, maybe it's something like that. So for the extracellular receptors that they first attach to are called our first messengers. So along comes our hormone, it attaches to this receptor. This is our first messenger. And I talked about, hey, it's going to pass the signal into the inside of the cell. When it comes into the inside of the cell, this is going to be our secondary messenger. So it's going to pass it into the inside of the cell membrane, and I'm going to have some sort of a secondary messenger. So we're passing a signal from outside to the inside of the cell. This inside of the cell, or this secondary messenger, can act like an enzyme. It can activate something. It can inhibit something. It's going to change something on the inside of the cell. What is amplification? This is when we have a small number of hormone molecules that bind to extracellular receptors, which then cause a big abundance of our secondary messengers. So what does this do? We have a small number and they kind of exasperate or accentuate the signal on the inside of the cell and really magnify it. This is amplification, right? That's what it means to amplify something is you start with something small and then you make it something big. So we have a small amount of hormone, it passes to the inside to a huge abundance of secondary messengers. G proteins, these are basically just an enzyme on the membrane, and we're going to see our hormones attached to this, and they kind of become the link between my first and second messenger. On this, what I would do, I think I have a picture. I would just study these pictures right here. What you're going to see when you look in here is you basically have a hormone attaches to your receptor on the outside of your cell. This is our cell membrane in this particular picture right here. And we can kind of see it up here. It attaches here. It's going to activate a G protein on the inside. So this is really my secondary receptor. When we see this, it can activate different things on the inside of the cell. It can use ATP to activate cAMP, which acts as a secondary messenger. It can open ion channels, activate enzymes, things like that. If I open ion channels, I'm going to see an influx of some sort of an ion. A lot of times that's calcium ions like we saw before. So basically by this hormone sending this signal, this protein using a secondary messenger is saying, hey, open an ion channel, or hey, activate an enzyme. To deactivate it, we would have a hormone that again would pass it to my G protein, but it has no ATP. So this cAMP is going to turn into AMP or AMP, which is going to shut off those enzymes. So we can activate or kind of ramp down things. So we can use hormones to ramp things up. We can use hormones to kind of calm things down. And this is just an example of looking at the inside of the cell messenger. All right, this is the second one, and we have a picture of this. And I think these pictures are a good study tool. You may want to just look at them. There's not a lot of questions about this, maybe one or two, but you can go back and look at it. And again, very similar. We have a hormone binds to a protein receptor. We have a G protein that's inactive, and we can basically activate it, which opens calcium ion channels. We kind of talked about that in the last picture, which allows calcium ions to influx, which causes an activation of enzymes. So hormones do have intracellular receptors. Steroid hormones, basically, as I mentioned before, they can diffuse right through the cell membrane. What they attach to their intracellular receptors oftentimes is found in the nucleus, can affect the DNA. If we affect the DNA, we affect what kind of protein we build. Protein tells cells how to act and what their job is. So we can alter the rate of production of proteins or some sort of activity that that cell is doing. One example is thyroid hormone. It's going to change the rate of transcription. What is transcription? Transcription is when we're copying our code from DNA to turn it into a protein. So basically, we are altering the rate of protein synthesis. And this shows an example. Here comes our hormone. It diffuses right through the cell membrane, attaches to a receptor. This particular receptor goes into the DNA of the cell, and it's changing DNA. And on this one, it's turning genes on and off in this particular example, which is changing our mRNA, which changes our proteins that we build, that alters something to do with proteins in our cell. This one shows the very similar. We're just binding to a receptor. The receptor goes into the cell and alters those. So it's this one's a hormone receptor complex. All right, hormone secretion works on negative feedbacks. What was a negative feedback loop? Do you guys remember? Yeah, it keeps homeostasis. So we basically are here. If we get out of whack here, we're going to turn on a hormone. It brings us back to here. When we get back to here, we're going to shut that hormone off. If we come down here, we'll turn on a different hormone till we get back to here, and then we'll shut it off. So it's a turn it on, turn it off, turn it on, turn it off. We have kind of one hormone creating a reaction at a time. When we get back to homeostasis, we're going to shut it off. So that's what negative feedback loops are. What can cause hormone secretions? It can be humoral stimuli. What is humoral? The humors of our body are basically the fluids, the bloods, the fluids in our body. Hormonal stimuli. So we can have a hormone arrive that say, secrete this hormone. And we saw that with some of our like thyroid stimulating hormone talks to the thyroid and says thyroid secrete hormone. So we may see something like that trigger a hormone secretion, or a neural stimuli with using neurotransmitters in the case like of the adrenal medulla, where we see a neurotransmitter tell the adrenal medulla, hey, secrete this hormone. So with our humoral, these can control secretions by the heart, pancreas, parathyroid, digestive systems. Neural, we talked about the hypothalamus. This is the highest level. That's the important thing to know about this. Neural stimuli is the highest level of control. Okay, so getting into each of those glands. So those are just some big overviews of what are the various ways we can send signals inside the body, chemical signals, neurotransmitters, paracrine, autocrine, endocrine. And we kind of talked about they can attach to the outside and send signals to the inside. All right, so this is kind of getting into our different glands, and we've talked about these a lot. So I may kind of cruise them pretty quickly. You guys can let me know if you need me to slow down. We talked about the pituitary gland. It is also called the hypophyseal or hypophysis. If you remember the cella turcica, we talked about the hypophyseal fossa in the cella turcica. Do you guys remember that from 201? So basically, your pituitary gland sits down there in the cella turcica. It is connected to the hypothalamus by the stalk. We learned this in the nervous system. That is the infundibulum. So the hypothalamus is really the brain portion that controls the pituitary gland. So it's reading a lot of information about the body to say, hey, we're a little out of whack. It's helping determine that homeostasis, your hypothalamus is. It is what determines, hey, we're out of whack here, go secrete this hormone so we can get back to here. So this is kind of the guy who's controlling the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is considered the master gland. Why? Because it secretes so many hormones. All right, this shows my anterior pituitary, my posterior, and this little middle portion right here, this is where my MSH comes from. And you can see here's my hypothalamus up here. So he has a direct connection to the pituitary gland through the infundibulum. We already talked about this with slides, so I'm going to go over it really quickly. What's the dark side? Anterior. The back side that looks neural is our posterior. All right, the hypothalamus secretes a lot of regulatory hormones. What does that mean? It's saying, hey, pituitary gland, go release a hormone that tells this gland to do this. So it's basically doing a lot of your stimulating hormones, like thyroid stimulating hormones, which tells the pituitary gland to secrete. So it does those regulatory ones. So here's an example. Hypothalamus can send signals to the anterior for hormones that need to be secreted by the anterior, or it can do this oxytocin ADH into the posterior. All right, you do not have to know any of these portions of the anterior. You just should know the name adenohypophysis or hypophysis. And this turns on endocrine glands. So basically it's regulating other endocrine glands to secrete those hormones. Does anybody need more time? You guys are good? The median eminence, you don't have to know about that. What you should know is that the big thing you need to know on the pituitary gland is we do have a whole blood system that runs through the pituitary gland. Why? Because we're releasing hormones. Remember, hormones are going to go into interstitial fluid or into the bloodstreams. So we have something called a portal system that allows those hormones to go right into the blood system, primarily through our anterior pituitary gland. So we have this portal system. I just want you to be familiar with that name, the portal system. And it allows those regulatory hormones to go into that bloodstream, which then allows it to travel to target cells. So here's an example. Here's our portal system. And you can see blood. So signals from my hypothalamus will travel through the portal system down to the anterior pituitary gland. And then those hormones can enter that blood system and then travel to the target cell. We have releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. So a releasing hormone is going to stimulate synthesis or secretion of a hormone from the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Inhibiting is going to shut that off. So we're either going to ramp it up or we're going to turn it off. So our inhibiting hormones are going to stop synthesis of hormones from the anterior lobe. These are coming from the hypothalamus. So it's the hypothalamus is saying anterior pituitary gland secrete this hormone, or it's saying, no, don't secrete this hormone, turn it off. And we're going to call those releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. So here's an example. Here's our hypothalamus. We're doing some sort of a releasing hormone. And in this case, we'll look at this chain right here. The hypothalamus will secrete a hormone saying thyroid releasing hormone. And that travels through the portal vein system to the anterior lobe. So now we're in the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And the thyroid releasing hormone says, release thyroid stimulating hormone. So anterior lobe is going to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Who's it going to boss around? The thyroid gland, right? So thyroid stimulating hormone goes to the thyroid gland and says, thyroid gland, release your hormones. What are two examples of hormones from my thyroid gland? T3, T4. So now I would see my thyroid release T3, T4. But I got a signal, a hormone signal from my hypothalamus, which went to my anterior lobe of my pituitary gland, which then went to my thyroid gland, and then my thyroid gland reacted. So we have this big chain to get this right here. Here's some other examples. This is corticotropin releasing hormone. It tells the pituitary gland, hey, release ACTH. Who's ACTH talking to? Adrenal cortex. So we're going to go all the way to the adrenal cortex. We're going to say, hey, adrenal cortex, release your hormones. In this particular example, it's releasing glucocorticoids. Which layer of the adrenal cortex releases glucocorticoids? The glomerulosa, right? Glomerulosa. All right, we also have inhibiting down here. So if you follow this, this is gonadotropin releasing hormone. It's talking to the gonads, FSH, LH. In the testes for FSH, we would inhibit it. In the ovaries, we're going to inhibit the estrogens. So you can basically track those through. But basically, it's just showing you the pathway of how the hypothalamus talks to the pituitary, which talks to the gland that releases the hormone. Yes. They do. You can get tumors. Tumors are a big one. And that's what I remember you may be down in 202 though, when we were talking about skin coloration. One of the things we were talking about that you can tell if you have a pituitary hormone, a pituitary tumor is you'll get the mask, like the dark mask on your face. Why? Because that tumor comes and it affects the MSH, which then is sending signals to the skin. They release melanin, and sometimes you'll get evidence of issues with the pituitary gland. But yes, there is oftentimes stuff with your pituitary gland that goes on. I don't know how common it is, but there's definitely, like, it's not that uncommon to have issues with that. Okay, so this was just talking, we're pretty familiar, you guys feel pretty good about the pituitary hormones and that are secreted and what they do. So I'm going to skip through those. I would study this chart. There's several of these, and I would go through and study these. I have a flow chart like this right on your test. And if you kind of look at these charts and you're familiar with it, you'll be fine. But basically, what it will look like on your test is I may block one of these out like this right here. And then you'll basically have to follow the path and say, oh, well, we're talking to the adrenal medulla. What might be secreted from the adrenal medulla? Epinephrine, norepinephrine. Or we may follow this path here, and we may say what is coming from the adrenal cortex and give you some choices. If you know your acronyms for your pituitary gland and you know that they're either stimulating or inhibitory hormones that come from the hypothalamus, you're going to be fine. I think it's pretty easy to follow these paths. Okay, so this is just kind of, we already looked at this. This is inhibiting. So in this one, we're going to inhibit growth hormone. The big thing I want you to know about growth hormone is we're going to do all the things. We're going to ramp up all the things that are going to cause growth in the body. So we're going to see increased metabolism, increased protein production, things like that. Usually growth hormones promotes lean body mass. Why? Because we're going to be using a lot of our fats. We're not using a lot of our glucose levels. Are growth hormones regulated by our releasing hormone or inhibiting hormone? Who's going to be secreting these two hormones? Growth releasing or growth hormone inhibiting? The hypothalamus, right? Hypothalamus would send this to the pituitary, which releases the growth hormone. So these releasing and inhibiting hormones are coming from the hypothalamus. And here you see them. Here's my hypothalamus. Here's my inhibiting or releasing, talking to the anterior pituitary. MSH, we know what it does, right? Posterior lobe, we know it does ADH oxytocin. You don't have to worry about these guys right here. We said one kind of ramps up your uterus during labor. We know, what's that? Yeah, and ADH is for dehydration. And you can see we have a direct release hormone coming from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary gland on those guys. Again, we have talked about all of these, but you may just review these little charts to see the flow from our releasing hormone to the pituitary gland, to the gland it's talking to, and what happens. Thyroid gland, really you have to know, we have thyroid follicles and the hormones we're going to release. So T3s, T4s, calcitonin. And this shows all of the bloodstream coming into our thyroid gland. Here's our thyroid follicles in here. This one should look familiar, right? We looked at a picture of these here. And we store this in as colloid in these thyroid follicles. And then we see C cells are actually outside of those follicles. And so T3, T4 are the big ones. T4 contains 4 iodine molecules. T3 contains 3 iodine molecules. You do not have to know all this. What do you need to know about T3, T4? T3 is the active form. It's going to trigger your metabolism. T4 is an inactive form attached to a globular protein, kind of waiting in the wings for when needed. So you don't have to know all these little details on this. T3, again, this is basically we're looking at our metabolism. If we have some sort of a decrease in T3, T4s, we'd see releasing hormone, which would talk to our anterior pituitary gland, which would tell the thyroid hormone, release those, and we would see our thyroid release. We said about 75% of T4 are protein bound, and about 70% of our T3s. Albumin is one of the really common blood proteins, and we're going to talk about this with the blood a little bit more. We will talk about what are those proteins in the blood that things bind to. All right, thyroid stimulating hormone, you just need to know what it does. It affects every cell in the body. You should know that about the thyroid hormone. Is every cell in the body doing metabolism? Does every cell in the body have a mitochondria and that's making energy? Yes, that's metabolism. So your thyroid hormone affects almost every single cell in the body because we have metabolism taking place in those. And so one of the things that it definitely affects in those cells is your mitochondria. All right, so that's what I want you to know. We get into our C cells. These are the ones that are producing our calcitonin. What does calcitonin do? Lowers blood calcium levels. We can lower it in a couple ways. One, we can go and put it on the bones. Two, we can stop absorbing it in the digestive system and we can get rid of it in the kidneys. So we will excrete it. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. We can excrete it in the kidneys and we can stop absorbing it in the digestive system and we can just let it pass on through. Plus we can take it out of the bloodstream and put it on the bones, which we don't even have that listed here. But our C cells, those ones that were outside of those thyroid follicles, are the ones that release that calcitonin. Here's all the effects of thyroid hormones. It elevates oxygen consumption. It raises body temperature. Why? One of the byproducts of metabolism is heat. So we're going to see an increase in body temperature. We're going to see an increase in the heart rate. We're going to see changes in respiratory centers, red blood cell formation. It can activate other endocrine tissues, and it helps with those minerals in the body, the turnover, either deposition of minerals or taking minerals out. Parathyroid gland, we know where they're at, right? And we know what they do. What do they secrete? Parathyroid hormone. What does parathyroid hormone do? Increases blood calcium levels. So here's our parathyroid glands. Here's our histological slide of it. Here's our main cells in here. Who does it talk to? It talks to osteoclasts. Osteoclasts are found on the endosteum of all of our bones. And it's going to cause those osteoclasts to go dissolve matrix, put that calcium into the bloodstream. It can also say, hey, kidneys, hold on to that calcium. Hey, digestive tract, absorb more calcium. So we're going to kind of ramp up the holding on to calcium in those digestive excretion areas, and we're going to go get it from our bones using osteoclasts. And this just shows an example. I'll kind of let you guys walk through that. Do you guys all feel good about calcitonin? All right, and this shows those levels. All right, adrenal glands. We talked about the adrenal cortex. This was the go find Rex, make good sex. And I think I've talked about most of these. We have steroid hormones, those corticosteroids. Adrenal medulla, that's our epinephrine, norepinephrine. You saw when we talked about the nervous system that norepinephrine could have an inhibitory effect or an excitatory effect. What made the difference if it was inhibitory or excitatory? Do you remember? It's the receptors who receives that norepinephrine. So some receptors see norepinephrine as an excitatory hormone, some see it as an inhibitory. In the case of adrenaline, we always see an excitatory response for it. So we'll see epinephrine and norepinephrine have a sympathetic response, which means it's going to ramp up that fight or flight response. Everybody good? And here's our little adrenal glands sitting on top of our kidneys. They're like little triangular hats. We have those cortex hormones and areas that we talked about, and we have that medulla. So here's our cortex, glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis. And this is what they secrete, the mineral corticoids. Aldosterone is a good example that we talked about. Mostly aldosterone is going to affect retention of sodium. In exchange, we get rid of potassium. Glucocorticoids, we said our big famous one from our zona fasciculata is the cortisol, which gives us kind of a glucose burst for stress responses for kind of that fight or flight. You hear a lot about cortisol as a bad stress hormone. Why? Because our body can't differentiate stresses very well. Something that we find emotionally stressful, like we're worried about something, our body sees it the same as running from the boogeyman. So our body can't differentiate. So we'll build up cortisols. Well, if we're not using glucocorticoids that get secreted into the body to fight or flight, because we're not fighting or flighting, what happens to all of that sugar that got dumped into the bloodstream? A lot of times your body will take it and store it away as fat to save it for later. And this is why people say, oh, you have like a stress belly or a cortisol belly. Have you guys ever heard that before? Yeah, that's stress. Oh, you haven't heard that before? There's a whole commercial about that, about how cortisol levels can give you a stress belly. That's because it's dumping those glucocorticoids, those glucose secreting signals, because it thinks your body needs to run away. Well, we need that glucose if we're working our muscles, right? But if we're just sitting there fretting and we're not working our muscles, we're not burning up that. So now we just go store it away, typically as adipose. Glucocorticoids, again, it creates more glucose. So we go get it from glycogen. We can restore it as glycogen. We can see it deposit as fats. Zona reticularis, That's that innermost layer. And we said it really affects like our androgens, right? Androgens, estrogens, those gonad areas. All right, and this shows our medulla. So here's the medulla of our little triangle hat. This is our epinephrine, norepinephrine. This would be our renal capsule. And then we get into our layers. Our glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis, mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and gonadocorticoids. And this shows the areas really well. This would be our capsule, glomerulosa, fasciculata, reticularis. This tells you, we kind of already talked about this, but you guys can look through that if you would like. Epinephrine, 75 to 80% of our medulla, 20 to 25% is norepinephrine. So the bulk of what we see come out of the medulla is epinephrine. It is our adrenaline, really, is this epinephrine. What are the results of epinephrine? What are some of the things that happen to our body with epinephrine? What? Yeah, increases heart rate, increased respiration rate, dilated eyes, glucose dump into the body, things like that. So this is what we see, accelerates breakdown of glucose. In adipose, it can store fat. Again, our body can't differentiate stresses. So if we're not really fight or flighting, we might go put more fat on because of epinephrine. Heart stimulation, all of that stuff. Pineal gland. Our cells are pinealocytes. They secrete melatonin. It's in charge of sleep cycles or circadian rhythms. It does some of that melatonin, which calms us down, helps us go to sleep, which is really part of those circadian rhythms. This shows our pinealocytes. Pancreas. Here's our pancreas. So this is our small intestines right here. And your pancreas secretes so many enzymes that dump right into the small intestines. We'll get into the big details of this in the digestive system. But then we have the two endocrine secretions from the pancreas, which come from those islets of Langerhans. And they are our glucagon and our insulin. Insulin's going to lower blood sugar. Glucagon's going to raise blood sugar. Exocrine secretions, we said they have a duct. So our exocrine secretions are going to really be our enzyme secretions. This takes up 99% of the pancreas. So the pancreas's main job is to secrete digestive enzymes, and I'm going to backtrack, that dump right here into the small intestine. So this is making all these digestive enzymes that are going to dump right here. But it also secretes a few hormones. And again, that's that glucagon and insulin. Our alpha cells produce our glucagon. Beta cells produce our insulin. And that's all you need to worry about on that. They come from the pancreatic islets. Everybody good? And this shows your islets. We've looked at those. I'm just going to skim through this because we already talked about what do I want you to know? When do we secrete glucagon? When our blood sugar levels are low. And we say, hey, liver, come convert your glycogen into glucose, put it into the bloodstream. So really, I want you to know why glucagon gets secreted and what happens when it does get secreted. It gets secreted because blood sugar levels are low. It's going to raise blood sugar levels by going and getting stored sugar from the liver and the muscles. When is insulin secreted? When my blood sugar levels are high. What's it going to do? Decrease my blood sugar levels. How? It absorbs the sugar out of my blood and goes and stores it away as glycogen, or it goes into cells that need it. So that's what I want you to understand about glucagon and insulin. Insulin, as we put glucose into cells, cells can now produce more ATP, right? So that is the whole point of cells uptaking glucose, is now we can put it into the mitochondria, do cell respiration on it, and make ATP. All right. A couple terms you should know. Hyperglycemia is abnormally high glucose levels in the blood. And diabetes mellitus. This is a high glucose concentration that kind of overwhelms the reabsorption capabilities of the kidneys. What does that mean? I have such high glucose levels in my blood that your kidneys are working overtime to try to filter that glucose out. But it messes up my concentration gradient. Where does water go? If water can move, how does it move? If it can move through a membrane, where does it move to? Well, let's talk about aldosterone. Aldosterone said, hold on to salt. What happened when I held on to salt? I held on to water, right? Water went to the salt. So let's think in terms of sugar. If all of a sudden I have all this sugar in my blood because insulin's not saying absorb it into cells because we don't have insulin, now my kidneys are working overtime to get rid of glucose. So it's going into the kidney tubules. So now I have a high abundance of solutes in my kidney tubules. Where's my water going to go? It's going to keep going into my kidney tubules, right? Because I have solutes in my kidney tubules. Water is going to where the solutes are, where the particles are, which means I'm dumping water out of my body because of the high concentration of sugar, which is why diabetics are so thirsty and they urinate all the time. It's because it messes up the whole dynamic of water movement in the kidneys. So they're basically dehydrating their body because of all the glucose they're dumping through their kidney tubules, all the water's going into it. So that basically is what you see here is we cannot keep up with the filtering of glucose. And we see all this water dump into those kidney tubules. Type 1 is inadequate insulin production by our beta cells. Most of your type 1 diabetes is juvenile onset, so children develop this. And this basically requires daily injections. Oh my gosh, excuse me. This is only like 5% of our cases. Most of our diabetes incidences come from type 2 diabetes. This tends to be our more dangerous or immediately life-threatening diabetic emergencies in juvenile diabetes. Type 2 is the most common form, and this is where we just don't produce enough insulin. And oftentimes you kind of, I think, wear your cells out. They produce so much insulin. So they say our tissues don't respond. We may get like an insulin, a downregulation of our receptors, something like that. So our tissues aren't responding to our insulin. Oftentimes this is because of obesity. And I will say, oftentimes it's obesity that is tied to carbohydrates or sugars, because it's sugars that cause the secretion of insulin, right? This is it right here, type 2 diabetes, and it's reversible oftentimes. How can I reverse this? Remember when we were talking about upregulation, downregulation? We're decreasing our sensitivity to insulin. Why? Because we're eating so much sugar all the time. We're constantly secreting insulin, and our cells are like, it's always there. We're going to ignore it now. But if we take all the sugar out of our bloodstream to the degree that we can, we stop secreting insulin. Now all of a sudden our cells are like, they become more sensitive to insulin. So by really controlling diet, particularly the amount of sugars that we're dumping into our bloodstream, we can make our cells more sensitive to it. And oftentimes people lose weight actually for it, because a lot of weight gain is tied to high sugars, high glucose. All right, if you have untreated or poorly managed diabetes, it can affect a lot of things. We can affect our kidneys. Why? Because it's filtering like crazy, right? To get rid of that excessive glucose and things like that. So we wear our kidneys out and affects our kidneys. It can affect your eyes due to blindness. And some of this has to do with pressures in the eyes, the optic nerve. I'm not exactly sure of the exact physiological what takes place in there, Early heart attacks, 3 to 5 times more likely. Diabetic neuropathies, basically this is numbness to parts of the body. You kind of lose your neural stimulus to parts of the body because of it. I have these elderly friends, they're in their mid 80s now, but this was probably like 15 years ago. And the husband, he was driving in his Pathfinder and he was like, my brakes went out. I couldn't get my brakes. Did I tell you guys this already? And then he backed up and he's like, my brakes didn't work. Well, it turns out he was never applying the brakes because he had a neuropathy. He wasn't feeling his feet and he didn't even realize it until later he got diagnosed. So nothing was wrong with his car. It was all about his foot. He didn't realize he wasn't actually able to feel and move his foot. Some of it can get so serious that it reduces blood flow, which can lead to sores that don't heal very well, which can lead to gangrene and things like that. Or it just can lead to necrosis. If we shut the circulation off to tissues, those tissues are going to die. So it can lead to loss of limbs due to infection, but also loss of limbs just due to lack of circulation. So it's not uncommon to see really severe diabetics end up with amputations for some reason. Feet and toes and legs seem to be the main thing. And that tends to be where neuropathies show up as well. Yes. Oh, really? Was it smoking? Interesting. I don't know. I've never heard of that before. That's really interesting. I don't know. That's really interesting. Because I feel like a lot of people who have been smokers have nicotine. It's very addictive. I don't know. That's interesting. I haven't heard of that one. Yeah, maybe it was. I don't know. That's really interesting. I'm gonna have to go look it up. All right, organs with secondary endocrine. Intestines, we talked about this, right? Small intestines secrete hormones that say, hey, we have a lot of carbs down here. Pancreas release carb breakdown enzymes. Kidneys, what were some of the hormones from the kidneys? EPO, renin, which renin helps to regulate blood pressure. EPO does red blood cell production. Heart, this is going to be some of our peptide hormones, our AMP, that again are regulating blood pressure. It helps to say, hey, our pressure is too high to our carotid arteries or to our aortas. And it does a lot of these talk to the kidneys. If my blood pressure is too high in my heart, sorry, there's like a little mat flowing around in here. If my blood pressure is too high for my heart, how can I release some of the pressure or dial down the pressure? Dial down the volume, right? Who's in charge for turning down the volume? My kidneys. I can dump volume out at my kidneys. So the heart and the kidneys really work together on that blood pressure regulation. Thymus gland we've already talked about, and the gonads we've talked about. Talked about the intestines. You guys feel you don't have to know any of the specific hormones, just know that the intestines secrete hormones. Kidneys, you need to know the EPO, the renin. Renin converts to angiotensinogen and angiotensin 1. We'll talk about those with the heart. Just know that this renin helps to regulate blood pressure. This just shows some of the stimulation of what we see with as far as our calcium and things, the kidneys, things the kidney and the liver do. This walks you through the EPO of the kidney. Heart, AMP, BMP, these are the ones I was just talking about. If our blood pressure becomes too excessive, we'll crank the volume down. How do we crank the volume down? We're going to help talk to the kidneys and turn the volume down. If our blood pressure is too low, can the kidneys help ramp up our blood pressure? Yeah, I can hold on to water, right? If our blood pressure is too high, we can turn the volume up, right? I'm sorry, if our blood pressure is too low, we can turn the volume up. We can hold water, put water back into our blood. Now we can up our blood pressure. Thymus, we said, does thymosin. Basically, what do you need to know about that? It says, hey, go mature T cells. So it's very tied to our immune system. Testes, all you need to know on your testes is it's going to produce these testosterones. You don't have to know the nurse cells or any of that. Ovaries, just know they do estrogen. They also do progesterone and estradiol. You don't have to know any of those. Just, know what they do. The big ones, estrogens. What do estrogens do? Secondary sex characteristics. Leptin is in our fat tissue. I haven't talked very much about leptin. It gets secreted to help control appetite. So if we've kind of filled our fat cells up, we'll secrete a leptin hormone that kind of does a, hey, I'm satisfied. It helps you to stop the desire to continue to have an appetite. You should know on your hormones, we have, I was going to check our time here. We have an antagonistic effect or a synergistic effect. Antagonistic just means it does the opposing effect. Synergistic means it works together to amplify an effect. Kind of like muscles. We talked about this with muscles, right? We had an agonist, an antagonist, and a synergist where we have multiple muscles working to do something. So you always have one hormone that does one thing. We've looked at this with calcium. One raises blood calcium, one lowers blood calcium. Synergistic means we can put two hormones together that are kind of helping to accentuate something. Permissive is when one hormone is needed to another to produce an effect. Integrative, just know the basically the definitions of these. Integrative means we're producing different types of hormones, but they're actually going to be kind of working together. And important hormones for growth, you should definitely know this. Growth hormone, which promotes lean body mass. It produces muscle production, length of muscles, more diameter of muscles, length of bones, more diameter of bones. Thyroid hormone, what's it going to do? It's going to ramp up metabolism so we can create more ATP for making longer bones, making longer muscles, producing more proteins, things like that. Insulin, why? Because insulin says take that glucose out of the blood and allow glucose into the cells so the cells can use it to make ATP. So really insulin is directly tied to my metabolism. Parathyroid, if I'm going to make big, strong bones, then I'm going to need lots of calcium, right? So if I don't have enough calcium, we're going to go get it from our bone storage. And then reproductive hormones, these are going to give secondary sex characteristics. Our androgens, our testosterones, are going to help to promote kind of the same types of things growth hormone does, lean body mass, bigger muscles, bigger bones, longer bones. Secondary sex characteristics, and then our estrogens are going to do the secondary female sex characteristics. So I would definitely understand that all of these are tied together for growing. None of these work by themselves. A lot of people tend to think, oh, growth hormone's the only one involved in growing. It's not. It takes all of these guys to have what it needs to create this growth. So again, growth hormone supports kind of the muscular system and the skeletal system. In adults, it helps with maintaining blood glucose concentrations. Why? Because it's going to encourage cells to take in that glucose. And it's also going to mobilize lipid reserves. So it's going to go take fats out of your fat cells, use it as energy to help promote lean body mass, which is what you want, right? Lean body mass, not a lot of adipose. So growth hormone helps us to use up lipids to create lean body mass. Thyroid hormone, this is going to, again, do metabolism. What happens if you're a baby and you don't have enough thyroid hormone? Your nervous system won't develop normally. Why? Because we need a lot of metabolism for all those, like sodium, potassium pumps all run on ATPs, right? So many things. You get down to the very basic things of the cell membrane, they're running off ATP. We need thyroid hormone for all of that. So you're going to see developmental delays. You're going to see growth delays. T4 concentrations, if they decline before puberty, you're going to see someone who doesn't develop fully. Why? Because this is encouraging metabolism for tissues for growth. So if we don't have this, we're not going to get the metabolism we need for growth. Insulin, you guys feel pretty good about insulin and parathyroid? I'm gonna skip those. Reproductive, you know, all the things that reproductive hormone does, secondary sex characteristics, all of that, guys. Stress, and I've talked about this a bit. Let me just talk about the stages of it. But basically, our body responds to stress. Our body is not very good at differentiating stress, like fight or flight stress from, oh, I'm worried about something stress. We have something called the General Adaptation Syndrome, or GAS, and it's basically a stress response. There are 3 phases. You should know these 3 phases for the stress response. First one's the alarm phase. It's like the, oh my gosh, something's happening. Then we're going to get into the resistance phase and then the exhaustion phase. And I'll talk about each of these phases in a little more detail. Is everybody good? All right, so alarm phase. This is your first response. Oh my gosh, something is happening. Who directs it? The autonomic nervous system. And it's going to be the sympathetic side of that autonomic nervous system. It's going to do that fight or flight response. So our body prepares for that. How does it prepare for that? Dilate our blood vessels, increase our heart rate, increase our respiration rate, dump glucose into the bloodstream. So now our muscles will be able to run away if they need to. Who's our dominant hormone? Epinephrine, adrenaline, right? So that is our alarm phase. Everybody good? Anybody want more time? Lauren's falling asleep. All right, resistance phase. If that stress lasts for more than an hour or so, we begin to get a little more resistant. We're not reacting in the same way that we were. The resistance phase can last for weeks or months, and we basically are going to see glucocorticoids become our dominant hormones, which, like cortisol, is one of those that we've been talking about. This is where we're going to reserve glucose, and we're going to try to mobilize lipids and amino acids. If we're not using this glucose, though, we may see it deposited as in adipose tissues. But we're going to assume that this is some sort of real stress, and we're going to see lipids and amino acids used for energy. Your nervous system uses glucose a lot, so it's always going to keep or try to keep a reserve for itself. All right, exhaustion phase. This is when we begin to lose the ability to maintain homeostasis. We begin to see a drop in potassium levels due to aldosterone. If we are losing, so if we're building aldosterone, what's aldosterone say? Who do we hold on to with aldosterone? Salt, sodium, right? Na. But if you think back to sodium potassium pumps, if we're moving sodium one way, who's moving the opposing way? Potassium. So if we're reserving sodium, we're excreting potassium because they use the same pumping system, and when one comes in, the other goes out, or vice versa. So in the exhaustion phase, we have held on to sodium using aldosterone So we are excreting potassium. So we'll begin to see a drop of potassium levels, and we're going to begin to see multi-system organ failure. It can be, oftentimes these are a little more severe than that, but not to say that mental stresses can't be that severe. It's not common though, to this point where we'd have multi-organ system failure. These would be stresses. Oftentimes that might come with some sort of an illness or a breakdown of something else that's creating a stress in the body. Something's not functioning right and it's putting stress on the body. All right, hormone changes, these can affect behavior, intellectual capabilities, memory, learning, and emotional states. We don't see a lot of functional changes with age. Mostly it's going to be reproductive hormones. Growth hormone obviously is going to be one, right? Some endocrine tissues become less responsive. And this kind of shows you all of your endocrine, all the other systems that we've learned about so far that your endocrine gland, your endocrine system works with. I want to backtrack to this because this is really bugging me. We see few functional changes with age. What does that mean? That hormone still is creating the same function when it arrives, but what do we see with age? A decline in what? The hormone itself, right? The hormone still creates the same function. So we're not going to see much of a decline in what that hormone does in the body, but the volume or the amount of hormone definitely decreases as you age. I want to make that clarification because I think this is a little bit misleading. It still does the same function, but we see really big declines in hormones. I always like to say hormones are a fountain of youth. You reach your peak hormone levels usually at about 30 years old. After 30 years old, all those hormones begin to decline. I know it is early. They kind of say puberty, and actually a lot of people are done with their height of puberty before 30. So I feel like 30 is actually being kind of generous with most people. But they say everybody's pretty much out of puberty by 30, which is why they pick that age. But by the time you've peaked in puberty, you've reached your max hormone production, and now it's all a decline after that. So it's all down here all after that. What's that? 25. Yeah. I think our book says 30, which I think is pretty old for puberty, the end of puberty, but anyway, so those hormones still do the same thing. We just see a drastic decline in the amount of hormone in some categories, like growth hormone. Even a lot of your thyroid hormones are going to decline, things like that. So big changes in the amount of hormones. All right, so that is your endocrine system. It is really heavy on the test on just knowing what glands secrete what. If you have a really good grasp on that, you're in pretty good shape on the endocrine system on that. All right, anybody have any questions? We're almost, I mean, we're done just a couple minutes early, but not